Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to the December edition of my 2017 One Month to a More Effective Compliance Program podcast series, where each month I take a deep dive into a specific part of a best practices compliance program. In the month of December, I'm taking a deep dive into better written standards, which form the very backbone of your compliance program. Written standards include codes of conduct, policies, and procedures, and we're going to be taking a very deep dive into the design of all of these, training, and revising and updating. We'll also take a look at the information communicated by the Department of Justice on what specific policies should be included in your best practices compliance program, including policies on gifts, travel, business entertainment, charitable donations, facilitation payments, third parties, and cybersecurity. We'll also take a look at certain enforcement actions and opinion releases to see what other information we can glean from these. My sponsor this month is my Doing Compliance Masterclass. We recently concluded the first masterclass in November 2017. I'm co-hosting this with Jonathan Marks at Markham LLC. We will be putting on a full series of classes in 2018. Check back for details. This month's podcast series will give you information which will allow you to set up the very foundation of your compliance program. My podcast series on 1 month to a more effective compliance program is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Day 16, the problem with facilitation payments. The original version of the FCPA, enacted in 1977, contained an exception for payments made to non-U.S. government officials who performed duties which were, quote, essentially ministerial or clerical, end quote, in nature. In 1988, Congress responded by amending the FCPA under the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act to clarify the scope of the FCPA's prohibitions on bribery, including the scope of permitted facilitation payments. An expanded definition of routine government action was included in the final version of the bill, reflecting the intent of Congress that exceptions apply only to the performance of duties listed in the subcategories of the statute or actions of a similar nature. Congress also meant to make clear the ordinary and commonly performed actions with respect to the permits, licenses, or licenses which would not include those government approvals involving an exercise of discretion by a foreign government official, where the action of the functional equivalent actions are the functional equivalent of obtaining or retaining business. The FCPA now contains an explicit exception to the bribery provision for any facilitation or expediting payment to a foreign official for the purpose of a performance, of a routine government action. The definitions listed are as follows: obtaining permits, licenses, or other official documents to qualify a person to do business in a country, processing government papers such as visas and work orders, providing police protection, mail pickup and delivery, or scheduling inspections associated with the contract performance or transit of goods across the country, providing phone service, power and water supply, loading and unloading cargo, or protecting perishable products from deterioration. And finally, the catch-all phrase, actions of a similar nature. There's no monetary threshold for determining when a payment crosses the line between a facilitation payment and a bribe. The accounting provisions of the FCPA require that facilitation payments must be accurately reflected in an issuer's books and records, even if the payment is permissible under the anti-bribery provision. So what are some of the risks associated with relying on the facilitation payment exception? Facilitation payments can carry legal risk even if they are permitted under anti-bribery laws of a particular country. In the U.S., enforcement agencies have taken a narrow view of the exception and have successfully prosecuted numerous FCPA violations stemming from the payments that could arguably be considered permissible facilitation payments. Violations of the accounting and book and record-keeping provisions of the FCPA are also more likely when a company makes facilitation payments. Abroad, companies are increasingly enforcing domestic bribery, anti-bribery laws, that prohibit such payments. Companies that allow facilitation payments face a slippery slope to educate their employees on the nuances of permissible payments in order to avoid prosecution under prohibited bribes. Always remember that U.S. enforcement authorities construe this exception pretty narrowly. There's no definitive guide on the circumstances under which facilitation payment applies. There may be less risk of enforcement if there's a bona fide facilitation payment made specifically for one of the purposes enumerated. Potential non-compliance with the FCPA's books and records provision is always a critical issue. While anti-bribery provisions of the FCPA permit facilitation payments, the accounting and record-keeping provisions of the law require companies making such payments to accurately record them in their books and records. Literally, you have to record them as facilitation payments. There has been increased enforcement of non-U.S. laws which do not recognize an exception for a facilitation payment. While the FCPA and certain other national anti-bribery laws contain exceptions for facilitation payments, such payments are typically illegal in the country they are made. In fact, there is not any country in the world which allows bribes to be paid to its government officials under its laws. In other words, there's no country which says it is legal to bribe our government officials. Accordingly, even if a particular facilitation payment qualifies as an exception under the FCPA, it is likely to be construed as a violation of local law. Thus exposing the payer, his employer, or related third parties to prosecution in one or more jurisdictions. While enforcement to date in this area has been limited, it nevertheless is something that we all need to watch. Certainly GSK in China could be a harbinger, and never forget, the UK Bribery Act does not allow facilitation payments. Corporate approaches to facilitation payments may exceed the legitimate scope and applicability of the exception. So we're still waiting for the resolution of the Walmart case, which hopefully will give us a fair amount of information on facilitation payments. But if you remember, one of the early defenses Walmart raised was that it was simply making facilitation payments in Mexico to obtain licenses and permits to open stores and do business. Businesses often struggle with how to address facilitation payment exception in their compliance policies and procedures. Businesses should be wary of allowing employees to decide on their own whether a particular payment is permissible. Unless such payments are barred completely or each payment is subject to pre-approval, there is always the risk that an employee, agent, or other person whose actions may be attributed to the company will make a payment in reliance on the exception, when in fact the exception does not apply. In addition, the temptation to improperly record otherwise permissible facilitation payments has been discussed above. So what are today's three key takeaways? Number one, the facilitation exemption is narrowly construed by the government and indeed by the courts. Do not forget there are 5 listed purposes for facilitation payments, and I'll just go over them once again. Obtaining permits, licenses, and other official documents to qualify to do business in a country, processing government papers such as visas and work orders, providing police protection, mail pickup or delivery, and scheduling inspections, for transit of goods, providing phone service, power and water supply, loading and unloading cargo, and then actions of a similar nature. So you've got to fit within those. And then the Walmart case, I think, is one that compliance practitioners need to pay attention to, as it may give us a fair amount of guidance on really what is and what is not a facilitation payment. This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed day 16 of 1 month to Better Written Standards, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow for day 17, where we continue our exploration of facilitation payments. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of 1 Month to Better Written Standards in a Compliance Program. I hope you'll join me tomorrow for another episode. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would ask that you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only daily podcast which will give you a hint or tip to improve your compliance program. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening. I hope you'll join me tomorrow. My podcast series of 1 month to a better compliance program is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.